For those of you joining us via the internet, welcome to Open Door Bible Church, West Ossipee, New Hampshire. Thank you for joining us today. I invite you to come and be with us in person. We're right next to McDonald's and the post office, so we're easy to find. We are in Acts chapter 27 today. As I've done the last couple of chapters, I'm going to go over with you a couple of verses to keep in mind as we go through the chapter. What you're looking for is, throughout the chapter as we go, that God is keeping these promises to the Apostle Paul. Because he's got some marching orders. In Acts chapter 9, verses 15 through 16, this is the first time he's telling his experience of getting saved. He's talking about a gentleman who talked with him as he just got saved. And this is what the Lord said to the gentleman. But the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. For I will show him as the Apostle Paul, how many things he must suffer for my name's sake." So, Paul's a chosen vessel. He's going to appear before kings. Paul's been given a promise he's going to make it to Rome. So keep that in mind. He's got a promise he's going to go to Rome. Mark chapter 13. There are some instructions given by Jesus. Now these apply not only to the Apostle Paul, they apply to us. But when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak, or whatever is given you in that hour, speak that. For it is not you who speaks, but the Holy Spirit. So God's promised to give us the words when we need it. Now that doesn't apply just to us going to court. That applies every time we're needing to talk to somebody and tell them about Jesus. He'll give us the words that we need. So let's get into chapter 27. Chapter 27 tends to be a sea story. All right. And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustinian regiment. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, I practiced that real hard, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Articulus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. Please notice the word us. Every time in Acts you see the word us, it means the apostle or the writer of Luke is present. Now, Luke kind of comes and goes. Sometimes he's telling the story firsthand. Sometimes he's telling the story secondhand. He's right here. In fact, you're going to see as we go through this, he was working for his passage. This was hands-on. So, verse 1, Julius, a centurion of the Augustinian regiment. Now, we don't know much about this particular regiment, but it was common for Roman soldiers to accompany the transport of criminals, those awaiting trials, and also merchant ships filled with grain going from Egypt to Rome. So there would be soldiers on board. This guy would be the guy who was the commanding officer of those soldiers. They sailed from a seaport on the northeast shore of the Aegean Sea, near Troas, and instead of sailing directly across the Mediterranean Sea, they sailed north to Sidon to perhaps unload cargo or pick up supplies. Now, Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. Aristarchus and Luke both went with Paul on this journey. Notice the us that tells us Luke was there. He gets kind treatment from this Roman officer. Now, Aristarchus, he was a believer from Thessalonica. He also made this trip with Paul, and we believe he went all the way to Rome with Paul. We find him speaking in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, where Paul refers to him as his fellow prisoner. So he apparently went all the way to Rome. He wasn't a prisoner per se, but he attached himself to Paul and went along with him. Now remember, for both this guy and Luke, it was a risky thing to associate themselves with Paul. So Paul was on his way to be tried. These guys could have been sucked right into that, but they didn't care. They went right along. All right, verses 3 through 8 are going to give us the first part of the journey. And the next day, we landed at Sidon. And Julius, that's the Roman commanding officer, treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and to receive care. When we were put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Sicilia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, the city of Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. When we had sailed slowly many days, and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmon. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lycia. So, this is kind of a running commentary of Paul's beginnings of the journey at sea. Verse 3, we see that this Roman officer treated him kindly, let him go and be with his friends. Paul had a fair amount of freedom. Now, Paul was there with other prisoners. I would suspect, and most of the commentators agree, that all of these other people were condemned already. They'd had their trial, they'd been condemned, they were on their way to Rome either for imprisonment or execution. Paul was the only guy in the group who had not been tried yet. Remember, they kept trying to try Paul, but they just couldn't get it done, and Paul appeals to Caesar, so he's now on his way to Caesar. So we see God's providence, we see God's provision, and that Paul gets a guy who's kind to him to be in charge of this trip. The guy looks out for him, he lets him go and visit his friends. He's probably going to them to gather supplies for the voyage. Now, in those days, when you traveled on a ship, the ship didn't feed you. There wasn't a lunch call and a dinner call. You brought your provisions with you. Or you went hungry. So Paul was probably gathering from his friends food and provisions for the journey. As I mentioned, Paul's probably the only guy in the group who wasn't a condemned criminal already. Verses 4 and 5 are just details about the journey. When they left Sidon, the voyage became difficult. The strong winter winds. Now, I'm going to get to winter winds 2 or 3 times in the message. They're beginning this journey at the wrong time of the year to be sailing in that part of the world. This is when everybody's already got their ships put up for the winter. So, it's a difficult journey. They're sailing right close to the island for protection. After they passed Pamphylia, they sailed for Myra. When they reached Myra, the centurion transferred the prisoners to a ship from Alexandria that was sailing to Rome. So, journey's already difficult. So far, they're in what you would know as a sailing ship. This is a ship with multiple masts and multiple sails. He's going to switch when he changes to this grain-carrying ship. Now, it talks in verse 6 about an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy. This would have been a grain freighter, taking grain grown in Egypt to Italy. Typical freighter in that period was 140 feet long, 36 feet wide, had one single mast with one single sail that you couldn't turn. So guess what? The boat went in whatever direction the wind was blowing. It had a tiller on the back of it, but you can't do much steering if the wind's taking you someplace else. So they pretty much got to go where the wind's going. That's going to be their problem. The wind's not going to go where they want to go at this time of year. All right, verses 7 and 8, the voyage became increasingly difficult as they sailed west. They finally reached a place called Fair Havens. It was a name, it was not a description. It was not Fair Havens. It was the worst place you could put a port for use at that time of year. It faced right into the wind that was blowing into the harbor. It was not a place where you'd want to sit on the boat for the winter, because the boat's going to be bobbing up and down like crazy. There's probably a fairly large crew on this boat. Fairly large crew is looking for recreation. There is none in Fairhaven. Let me translate that to you. There were no bars. There was no entertainment. They would be laid up for 3 months. This was not the place they wanted to spend 3 months. They wanted to get to a party city. This was not a party city. All right, verses 9 and 10, Paul's going to give us some advice. Now, when much time had been spent, and sailing was, get this, was now dangerous, because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives." Paul's saying, dummies, let's not do this. Now, you got to understand, the captain and the commander of the soldiers had a different set of motives. The captain of the boat makes no money unless the boat arrives in Rome and unloads the cargo. The commander of the army, his mission is to get the prisoners to Rome. Nobody making decisions wants to hang around for 3 months and wait for the weather to change. So, it mentions in here a fast being over. So if you happen to have a calendar for the year AD 59, which I was able to find, it would tell you this was probably October 5th. It was what the Jews referred to as the Day of Atonement. The idea being that winter is rapidly approaching and it's becoming too dangerous to sail. Conventional wisdom in those days said you stopped sailing about September 14th and didn't start again until the winter was over. Well, I'm past September 14th, I'm now on to October 5th. Really bad weather to be sailing in that part of the world. Paul advises them that there's going to be loss, that there's going to be problems. Now, I don't think Paul at this point is necessarily speaking as a prophet. Paul's speaking as a guy with a lot of sailing experience. So if you go back and you look at Paul's travels up to this date, they estimate that by this time Paul had sailed 3,500 miles in his missionary journeys. So Paul's a pretty experienced sailor at this point. Probably more experienced than many of the sailors on the boat. Now, Paul knows the seasons, he knows the conditions, he's got some God-given wisdom, and he's telling them, let's not do this. By the way, little background to Paul. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25 tells us that by this point in his life, Paul had already been shipwrecked 3 times. Paul's experience being shipwrecked. Paul's experience being afloat in the ocean. Didn't like it. Didn't want to do it again. Is strongly recommending against undertaking this endeavor. So, we're going to see if Paul's wisdom or money wins out. What do you think? Probably money. All right. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix. Phoenix was a harbor of Crete opening towards the southwest and northwest, and winter there. So they want to get to a harbor where they can tie the boat up, the wind's blowing in the right direction, and they're not going to be uncomfortable being on the boat, being tied up for 3 months. So, I mean, not a surprise. Centurion gets paid for delivering prisoners. Boat captain gets paid for delivering grain. Everybody's anxious to get home and get paid. All right. Tells you here the place that they were in wasn't suitable to winter in. Wind came in the harbor from the wrong direction. And then they did the dumbest thing you could do. They took a vote. By the way, the majority is almost always wrong. Right? So the majority wanted to set sail. Majority didn't want to spend 3 months bobbing up and down in this harbor with no place to go and no entertainment. And by the way, they're only going to go 40 miles. How much trouble could they get into in 40 miles? Ugh. All right. So they didn't listen to what the Apostle Paul said. Later on, Paul will get human and tell them he told them so. All right. So they're going to have a good start to the journey. Goes downhill real fast. Verses 13 through 16. When the south wind blew softly. Doesn't that sound nice? That sounds like sailing conditions. When the south wind blew softly. Supposing they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose, called Euroclydon. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the shelter of an island called Claudia, we secured the skiff with difficulty. So let me go through and decode all the sailing language for me. Verse 13, when the south winds blew softly. Boy, everything's going to be good. We're going to make this journey. Won't take any time at all, and we'll have a nice place to spend the winter. They get a tempestuous headwind called Euroclydon. Now, this wind was feared by ancient sailors for its destructive power. Now, you've never heard of this, so let me give you a New England term. It's a nor'easter. It's bad. Seas are high. Winds are blowing. And they're in a ship you can't steer. None of this sounds good. So verse 15 says, when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. We couldn't steer the boat. The wind's carrying us along, and we're going to go wherever the wind takes us, because we can't buck the wind, we can't fight the wind. This is not a steerable sail. Boat wasn't designed to be in this kind of weather. Now it says we secured the skiff with difficulty. So they had a little launch, a little rowboat that they carried with them. They would let this down. One of the things they would use it to do was kind of guide the boat into the harbor. They put a bunch of guys in it who would row and pull the boat into the harbor. And if the storm got really bad and they had to secure extra ropes around the ship to hold it together, they would use this boat to do it. So the weather's so bad, they're going to pull the thing up on board. Now notice it says, we secured the skiff with difficulty. Who's writing? Luke. When Luke tells you we secured the skiff with difficulty, Luke's helping to pull the rope, to pull the skiff up over the side of the boat. They put everybody to work. Hey, guys are in trouble, all hands on deck. So Dr. Luke is there hauling the rope up over the side of the ship to pull the skiff in. So he worked on this journey. All right. Now they're getting worried. Now they're going to start doing things to save the ship. By the way, if you lose the ship, you've lost out. All right, verses 17 through 19. When they had taken it on board, it was the skiff, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on Thyatros sands, they struck sail, and so were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Right, so verse 17 talks about they using cables to undergird the ship. This was kind of a normal emergency procedure. You're in heavy seas. This is not a metal boat. This is a wooden boat. This is layer and layer of wood nailed on to a frame. boat's being really tossed and beaten, and they're worried about the side panels coming off the boat. So they take a rope from one side, wrap it under the boat, and bring it up on the other side. Remember all those things you see sticking up in the boat to tie stuff to? But they tie in these ropes that are holding the bottom of the boat together so the boat doesn't separate. So they're really concerned. It says they struck sail and so were driven. So it's so bad, now the sail that you can't turn is working against them. So they've dropped the one sail. The mast is probably still sticking up. No sail. Great big broad-sided boat. It is just blowing wherever the wind wants to blow it. There's no control over it. They're just literally going with the wind. And it says they did this for many days. I mean, remember, we're only going 40, 50 miles. We're just going the other end of the coast. How much trouble can we get into? They've been at this for many days. Verse 20. Now they're really getting desperate. Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. So it's been many days. They haven't seen the sun and they haven't seen the stars. Now these guys didn't have GPS. They didn't have a direction finder. They probably didn't have a compass. The only way they navigated was by, we know the sun comes up in the east and sets in the west, and we know where the North Star points to. Well, if you haven't seen the sun or the stars in many days, you have no idea where you are other than in the water. Where you are in the water, you have no idea. So, I mean, they've given up hope. When we get to verse 37, it's going to tell us there were 276 people on board, between prisoners, soldiers, and crew. That's 276 people who've given up hope. They've decided they're going to die. It's a matter of when do we drown. But they've given up hope. Paul comes along and tries to encourage him. He does get human in the process. Verse 21. But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, I wish I could tell you his next statement was terribly spiritual. Paul's human. Paul's like you and me. Men, you should have listened to me and have not sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. Paul had to get it out of the system. I can just picture the Apostle Paul trying not to say it. I can see him trying, but it got the best of him. I told you so. He goes on. Now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Now, that's good news to some people. It's not good news to the boat's captain. If we lose the ship and we lose the cargo, how much money does he get for the voyage? Nothing. By the way, he's lost the boss's ship. I suppose the boss gives him another ship. Probably not. He's probably done being a captain. So he's not happy. Everybody else thinks this is pretty good news. Now, lest you think these guys were spiritual, it says after long abstinence from food. They are not fasting so they can pray. They're too seasick to eat. I mean, this boat's done nothing but bob up and down for 14 days. Paul does blurt out. You should have listened to me. Paul's human. We're human. We all do stuff like that. But then he gets back to being Paul. I encourage you to take heart. So he's God's messenger. He's bringing a message of hope to this crew. He's telling them that nobody's going to die. Now, that's pretty good news. Now, was Paul worried about dying? Perhaps momentarily. But remember, where's Paul headed? Rome. God's told him he's got to appear in Rome. That means Paul's going to get there alive. Now, the rest of the guys, we weren't sure yet, but now we're sure. Not going to be any loss of life. Now Paul tells them how he knows this. Verses 23 through verses 23 through 26. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. That's comforting. Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God, it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. Okay. Run aground means we're going to crash the boat. Now, we're going to live. We're going to crash the boat. I'm not sure everybody's terribly encouraged by the message, but Paul's delivering it. So, verse 23, Paul says, there stood by me this night an angel. So God sends a messenger to Paul to bring him good news. Now, God dealt with Paul different ways in different situations. God never dealt with Paul the same way twice. Guess what? God's probably never going to deal with you and me the same way twice. God's going to deal with us a different way in each situation. One of the things we try to do is we try to figure out God's pattern. Because if we can do that, we can make God work to our advantage. God's not like that. You don't get to figure out how God's going to bail you out. You have to believe He's going to bail you out, but you don't get to tell Him how to do it, and you don't get to try to figure it out. So, remember, there's been situations where Paul was in prison and the doors just opened. Okay? That's not what we're doing this time. There's been times when Paul saw Jesus. This time you get to see an angel. Didn't deal with Paul the same way. And that's going to be true in our lives. God's going to deal with us different each time. Don't think that the next time you get in trouble, God's going to bail you out the same way He bailed you out last time. He will bail you out. It will be different. It will probably not be the way you expect. God bails me out all the time. Rarely is it the way I expect. And never is it the way I tell God to bail me out. Because God does His own thing. I'm glad He does His thing and doesn't do my thing. So, there's been this angel. He's given him a message. He tells him, don't be afraid. Now, Paul might have been momentarily afraid. He knew he's going to Rome. But he's got this message now to share with the rest of the crew. Do you suppose the crew is starting to listen to Paul? Now, not so much in the beginning, but we're going to see Paul's got more influence on this crew. Now, if it said God gave him the lives of all these people, there's 276 people on the boat. So on the boat, there's Luke that's saved, there's Aristarchus that's saved, there's Paul. I don't read about anybody else that's saved at this point. But you're supposed to start to listen to Paul? You suppose when Paul talks about Jesus, they're starting to pay attention? I think so. So, the angel tells him, God has granted you all those who sail with you. I don't think that just meant Vivek Ramaswamy wants me to vote for him. That's why my phone keeps ringing. I think God not only gave them their lives, I think God allowed them to lead a number of these people to Jesus. I think a lot of those folks got off the boat believers. He tells them to take heart. He's encouraging them. He's sharing with them the God that he trusts in. Now, here's a guy in the worst circumstances you can imagine. He's been tossed back and forth for 2 weeks. There's no sail on the ship. You can't steer it. You don't know where you are. And he's got confidence in God. Now, does that mean the ship stopped bouncing and they all stopped being seasick? No. But it means they could have confidence in God. God's not always going to make our problems go away. But God will go with us through the problems. I'd rather have a problem and have God with me than not have a problem and have God not with me. I think Paul's figured that out. So he tells them the ship's got to run aground. That's another word for shipwreck. And it's going to be on a certain island. God didn't tell him, or the angel didn't tell him, the name of the island. It says you're going to shipwreck on an island. Now, could the angel have told him the name of the island? Absolutely could. Paul's going to walk by faith. Just like you and me got to walk by faith. All I know is that God's going to take care of me. I don't know how, when, where, why. I just got to have faith. Take it one step at a time. You have to have faith and take it one step at a time. And so does Paul. So he doesn't get all the details. He gets an island. He doesn't get the island's name. Just an island. All right. Verses 27 through 29. Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they got a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. The water's getting shallower. All right. Then fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed the day to come. Suddenly they're religious. Now, Apostle Paul's a good influence on them. I bet you there's now 276 guys praying, or at least saying amen. They now figured out Paul's connected to something they want to be connected with. All right, verse 27. When the 14th night had come, that's 2 weeks with no food, no sun, no moon, not knowing where you are. That's 14 days of being seasick. Good. Coming to an end. Sailors sensed they were drawing near some land. Now, the only way I could figure out they sensed they were coming near land is they could hear the waves breaking on something. There's a different sound. The waves are breaking on the shore. So they take a sounding. They would throw a rope over the side with a weight on it. They'd see how far down the rope went. Well, the first time it went down to 20 fathoms. If you're not a sailor, that's 120 feet. Second time they put the rope down, it went down 15 fathoms. That's 90 feet. We've just lost 30 feet under the boat. We're getting closer to land. You know, land goes out, tapers off. And you start getting closer and closer to land, something's happened. Well, they can't see anything. They can hear the waves breaking. They know they don't want to run into the waves. That's a bad thing. So they throw some anchors out. If one's good, two's better, three's better, four's probably all they had. They threw out everything they had to hold the boat from breaking on the rocks. And then they did what they should have done in the first place. They prayed. For some reason, we always wait till we've tried everything else before we pray. I would love to do a message some Sunday on pray first. Maybe we could avoid all these other things. So, we're close to the shore. There's 4 anchors out. There's some guys who really want to get off the ship. They've been on the ship long enough. All right, verses 30 through 32. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow is the front of the boat, Paul said to the centurions and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. It became instantly really important. These guys didn't leave the ship. Paul said to the centurions and soldiers, he tells them, you got to stay in the ship, you can't be saved. So the soldiers, notice this, not the sailors, the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it go. They want to be saved. They've now figured out we ought to listen to what this guy Paul is saying. If Paul says we can't be saved if anybody gets off the boat, nobody's getting off the boat. All right. Now, by the way, notice when suddenly listening to the Apostle Paul, the same guy who at the beginning of the chapter said, let's not take this voyage, and they ignored. Suddenly Paul has credibility with the soldiers, with the crew. So, they cut the ropes off to let the ship go so nobody can escape. Verses 33 through 38. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, Today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. And when they said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them. Sounds like what Brother Robert did this morning. I think they had communion on the boat. Now, not everybody may have known they were having communion. Paul knew. Luke knew. Aristarchus knew. They're having communion. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all we, so that's Luke included, in all we were 276 persons on the ship. So, Paul's telling them, you got to eat something. You got to eat something for your survival. They were going to need their strength to survive. We had some physical work to do. Some of them had to swim to shore. Some of them had to get on a piece of wood that broke off the boat and paddle to shore. By the way, so you understand how a pastor's mind works? I went through all these verses trying to decide, did Paul know how to swim? Or was he a guy holding on to a board? But everybody got to shore. But you need the strength to do it. So he's trying to get him to have something to eat. He does what sounds like communion to me. Now, remember, in those days, often communion was just part of the meal. It was how you started the meal. You took some bread, you broke it, you took it in memory of Jesus, you took some wine, you had it in memory of Jesus, and then you finished your meal. There have been times here on occasions where we've done communion in the back room as part of lunch. It's okay. That's how the early church did it. It's just taking the time to remember what God did. So, Paul's reminding them what God did, part of his witness to them. Verse 38, so when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship. They threw everything that was left into the water. Because we don't want the ship to be too heavy, because we want it to be able to get into ground. All right, here's beaching the ship, verses 39 through 41. And when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach. Onto it, they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosening the rudder ropes, they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where the two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow, that's the front of the boat, stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. So that heading into this opening, probably where a small stream or river is running into the ocean, they head for the middle of this. They get the front of the boat stuck there. Now the front of the boat's stuck. The front of the boat's not going anyplace. The back end is still hanging out of the inlet in the water, which is coming from two different directions and breaking the back of the boat up. So you're looking at the front of the boat and it looks good. The back of the boat is disappearing, piece by piece, bit by bit. Wow. It says they let go of the anchors. They didn't spend a lot of time. They just cut them loose and let them go. They're on a piece of land. They don't know what it is. I will tell you they were in Malta, and that piece of land today is called St. Paul's Bay. How do you suppose they got that name? Now, by the way, if you had a map of the area and you're trying to figure out where they bounced around in this journey, if they missed Malta, Malta was the last piece of land for the next 200 miles. The boat wouldn't have held together for 200 more miles. You want to talk about God's taking care of them? You want to see God's hand of providence? They missed that island. There's nothing for 200 miles. God stuck them right where they needed to be. Said they threw everything they had out, The front stuck fast and the back's breaking up. There's not a lot of time to have a meeting about what we do next, because the back of the boat is disappearing, foot by foot, coming closer and closer to where they're left standing. So, we got to have a plan. The soldiers got a plan. By the way, soldiers got a code. I had Pastor Terry here, he'd yell, hoorah. They had a code. Brother Walter, you know what the code was? Anybody escapes, you die. They knew the code. Got to take care of this. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners. Thus, any of them should swim away and escape. Because if you lost your prisoner, you died in place of the prisoner. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, is God providing for him again. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. I don't know if Paul jumped in or Paul waited for a piece of wood. And the rest, some on boards, some on parts of the ship, and so it was that they all escaped safely to land. God had a plan. God was keeping the Apostle Paul alive. Now, soldiers want to kill the prisoners because they know if they don't, they're going to pay with their lives. I can understand where the soldiers were coming from. God puts it in the centurion's heart to save Paul. Now, he can't save just Paul, he's got to save everybody. So, we're not going to hurt any prisoners. So, now Paul's spared again. God's taking care of him again. Now, remember what God told Paul, what the angel told Paul God said. God has granted you the lives of all who sail with you. God kept his word. By the way, if you haven't figured it out, God always keeps his word. You know what our problem is? Often we don't know God's word well enough to know what the promises are. But if we find them, and we grab onto them, and we hold tight, God always keeps his word. And that is the end of the chapter. One more chapter to go. No, Miss Elizabeth, I'm not doing one more chapter this morning. But we're going to see in the next chapter, once again, Paul's spared. God takes care of him. God keeps his promise. So, deep breath. The Apostle Paul is now on land. Everybody else is on land. The ship is gone. It's just sits there and breaks up till it's gone. So they're not sailing away on that ship. They have another ship show up together. That's the end of our chapter. Did you see God take care of Paul through the whole chapter? All right. Questions, comments, stuff you saw you never saw before? This is your chance to talk to me. Because I'm thirsty and I need a drink. Yes, Miss Elizabeth.
I was just thinking, you let us know that Paul had traveled 3,500 miles on a ship. That the man would really want to know how to swim.
And he doesn't tell us. That's one of those things you just don't know. But that was the first question in my mind. Was Paul one of the guys who could swim? Was he off the boat first, or was he like the captain and got off the boat last? But he got there, and that's really the important part. But I imagine there were guys grabbing for those pieces of the back of the boat that were breaking up so they could float to shore on. But God took care of them. What else did you get out of the chapter? What else spoke to you?
Where did the bread come from?
It's a ship full of wheat. I'm suspecting they made it before they threw the wheat overboard. That's what I would do if I was a boat full of wheat. I'd grab some and make some bread.
But it has to cook.
Get a little stove in the ship someplace. I'm not sure they would have been real fussy how good the bread was and whether it had lumps in it and whether it was cooked to the right doneness. I think they would have eaten anything they could get down. And they did. And again, they all needed this strength to get to shore. Nobody, as far as I could tell, jumped off the front of the boat and walked ashore. Everybody either swam or paddled or took a hunk of broken boat with them to get there. But they had enough strength to get there. They listened to Paul. I'm sure Paul's credibility is going up and up and up as the voyage goes on. And we'll see him doing more stuff next week. Last chapter of Acts, next week. By the way, just spoiler alert, the story just ends. You want me to tell you all the things that happened at the end of the story? It doesn't. It just ends. So remember, what was the goal of the book of Acts? Why did Luke write Acts? Back to week 1, I told you. Book of Acts was to show the progression of the church from a Jewish church in Jerusalem to a Gentile church in Rome. That was Luke's job. Luke got Paul from Jerusalem to Rome. That's the end of the story. He accomplished the goal. The goal was to show the spread of the church, show the church moving out of Jerusalem, showing the church moving from being exclusively Jewish to being Jewish and Gentile, which is good news because all of us here are Gentiles. Unless somebody snuck in, I don't know where of it, but I'm pretty sure all of us are Gentiles. So we're included and we're glad. But that was what Acts was about. It was to show how the church moved out of Jerusalem, out of being just Jewish, all the way to Rome. By the way, what was the mission? Preach the gospel to the ends of the earth. In Luke's day, Rome was the end of the earth. We had accomplished the Great Commission. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth. Rome was the end of the earth. Great Commission has been fulfilled. Paul's job was to get to Rome. Paul's in Rome. End of the book of Acts. Come back next week and we'll tell you all the details that goes with it. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I like how you said that, like Paul, God deals with us in different ways each time. And most of the time it's not in a way that we expect or that we ask for, but in a different way. But He's been with us through the whole journey.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't learned yet. I keep telling God how to solve my problems. And God manages to solve my problems without my help. And I'm just glad He solves them. I'm glad He still loves me. Anything else before we bring the worship team up? Yes, ma'am.
I love the idea that we just trust God in His promises and in His word, even if it's just a baby step.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not always going to make sense. It's not always going to be, pardon the pun with the story, smooth sailing. Sometimes there's going to be stormy seas, but God will stay with us. Jesus said, I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. Now, it doesn't say I'm always going to be comfortable. It doesn't say I'm always going to enjoy the ride. But it says I'm never going to be alone on the ride. Jesus is always going to be right there with me. Yes, sir.
Another thing that you said that made sense is that when Paul was telling the sailors were ones that their lives are in their hands, actually, because they're the only ones that know how to run the ship. They're the technical people, but yet they were going to go off on that skip to get to land. And but the
Soldiers.
Put their faith in Paul instead of these technical people. So it shows that science and technology is not always the way to go, but you got to believe it. So